Alexandra, good morning. It is my morning. It is your evening for you. So, dobro večer.
Доброго вечора.
I don't know much Ukrainian, but I do know that. Thank you so much for joining us today. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it. It is an honor to have you with us. We are still waiting for our other person. Every Friday night, Nancy, Gina Christian, and I host a Understanding Genocide segment so that we can try to help people all over the world understand what is exactly genocide and how it is happening in Ukraine. And we talk for about 3 hours every Friday night my time. It's Saturday morning your time, and we've been doing this since August. We've been getting quite the extensive education and going through reports like the New Lines reports and things like that. But we wanted to try to have a conversation with you because one of the things that I feel we don't talk about enough are some other things. But Nancy, I will give you the opportunity to say hi. I'm going to see if I can track down where Gina is.
All right, no worries. Yes, Oleksandra, thank you so much for joining us. I know that I was giddy like a school child when I heard you were going to be able to join us after hearing your Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in 2022. I was brought to tears, and it's been so inspiring. And it's just wonderful to have such a strong advocate for Ukraine joining us and speaking to what is happening in Ukraine and what we as ordinary citizens can do to help spread the word and help people understand clearly what's happening and why it's so important to our society. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for this invitation.
And I see we've had Gina join us on the speaker panel. So Prince, I will turn it back over to you. And I know Gina's going to want to say something quickly as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Gina.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to meet you, Oleksandra. I actually am a Catholic journalist based in the US, and I think we have a mutual friend in Archbishop Boris Kudziak. And I included you in an article back in July of 2023. I was blessed to be in Ukraine at that time, and you folks had called for a new constitution for Ukraine post-war. And so I managed to cover that, and that kind of helped to introduce me to your work. So thank you for being here.
Nice to meet you.
Alexandra, thank you again for joining us. You are a human rights lawyer, focuses on issues in Ukraine and the OSCE region, leads the Human Rights NGO Center for Civil Liberties, and coordinates activities of the initiative of the Euromaidan SOS. And you have also helped to put together and launch an initiative called Tribunal for Putin, which is an initiative to document international crimes under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in all regions of Ukraine targeted by Russian attacks. And you have many accolades, which are just amazing, many awards, including the Center for Civil Liberties being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022, which, as Nancy already mentioned, your Nobel acceptance speech was just absolutely stunning and amazing. And you can ask, I co host 5 hours a day here, and you couldn't ask anybody who listens to me. I quote this regularly: you don't have to be Ukrainian to support Ukraine. It is enough to be just a human. Thank you for those words. And we are all here, and we are all human with you, and we all support Ukraine 100%. Is there anything you would like to add before we get going?
Probably we can start.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much. All right. I was going to actually just start out by saying, I decided to contact you actually before this tweet, but when I saw this tweet from you in March, I decided to just throw caution to the wind and send you a DM, and you responded, and here we are, and I appreciate that very much. But the thing that got me in this tweet was the second tweet in the thread, and it was about watching 20 Days in Mariupol. And what you said in there in your second tweet there is, I've been documenting war crimes for 10 years now. This theme became one of the central ones in my work. I have already had too much pain and emotional experiences. Still, I strongly recommend everyone does watch, who does not live in Ukraine, to watch it. It's truthful, fearful, and sobering film. Please watch it on my behalf. And I sent you a message saying, I promise I will watch it on your behalf. And I also said that what I think people miss very often is what has been happening in Ukraine before 2022. What happened in Ukraine as far as war crimes between 2022, before 2022, since 2014. Can you share a little bit with us? Just, I'm sure there is a lot, and we will have more questions as we go. Just a little small overview of what you were doing documenting war crimes before 2022.
Sure, I will do, but first I will also refer to this tweet which I mentioned, and I'm very grateful that you saw the film on my behalf, because frankly speaking, I still can't go to exhibitions or to read books or to watch film about Russian war against Ukraine. There are also another thing which I can't do for all these 10 years. I can't interview children who were affected by this war. But my colleagues did, and so probably I will start our conversation with one personal story. And this is a story of 10-year-old boy Ilya from Mariupol. When Russians tried to siege the city, they didn't allow International Committee of Red Cross to evacuate civilians. Hence, Ilya and his mother, like other people in Mariupol, had to hide in the basement of their residential buildings from the Russian shelling. They melted snow in order to get water, and they made fire to cook at least some food. But when supplies ran out, they were forced to go out, and suddenly they appeared in the center of Russian shellings. Ilya's mother was hit in her head, and the boy's legs was torn. With the last strength, his mother took her son to the friend apartment. It was no medical assistance. Prior to this, Russians deliberately destroyed maternity hospital and entire medical infrastructure in Mariupol. That is why, in this friend apartment, Ilya and his mother just laying on a couch and hugging each other. And they were laying like this for several hours. And this 10-year-old boy, Ilya, told to my colleague that his mom died and got frozen right in his arms. We have, for current moment, 70,000 such stories in our database, which we jointly recorded since the large-scale war started. But you know that this war started not in February 2022, but in February 2014, and it's going on for 10 years already.
Yes, it is. And it has been. And I know Ilya's story. I relay not as completely as you, as well as you, but I relay just a bit of his story on a regular basis. Um, I see him. I see him traveling and sharing and being a very brave and strong guy, um, talking about the experience that he had. And thank you for sharing that. And I can tell you, um, you don't have to watch all the awful things. We watch them also. It's one of the things that I say to people on a regular basis, Alexandra. What I say is, I want to watch, I want to witness, I want to read and I want to hear all of the things that other people can't. I want to be able to be a witness to those things so maybe I can share with others the horrible things that they can't watch. Maybe I can share them in a maybe a lighter way so that they can understand exactly what is happening in Ukraine. And I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Gina, do you have something that you would like to ask?
Sure. I would like to just drill down a bit. When in 2014 you were sending your own teams to document the war crimes taking place in Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk, and I was wondering if you could talk more about the process, because that reminds me, as we've discussed in our previous podcasts, of how important eyewitness accounts of the atrocities are. We had previously talked about the work of James Mace in documenting the Holodomor, and certainly other journalists, for example, with the Cambodian genocide, they've had to rely on eyewitness testimony that in cynical times hasn't always been well received, particularly in the case of Cambodia. Can you talk about what is it like documenting these crimes? What's the process? How did you do this work, and how do you continue to do it?
We was the first human rights organization who sent mobile groups in February 2014 to Crimea, and then later in March to Donetsk and to Lugansk regions. And I remember that in that time when we trained our first mobile groups, we have no idea that the war started. Now it's become very obvious that when Ukraine got the chance for the quick democratic transition after the collapse of the authoritarian regime, in order to stop us on this way, Russia invaded. But for that moment in February 2014, we was unprepared. It was so surrealistic to see Russian soldiers in our land that people really can't believe that it's happening. And this is also very important to understand the roots of this war, because Putin tries to invent millions of reasons why he invaded an independent country. He told about NATO, etc., etc. But the truth is that Putin is not afraid NATO. He's afraid of the idea of freedom, which came closer to Russian border. Because prior to this, millions of people in Ukraine stood up their voice against corrupt authoritarian government, and they peacefully demonstrated just for a chance to build a country where the rights of everybody are protected, government is accountable, judiciary is independent, and police do not beat students who are peacefully demonstrating. And we are paid a high price for this. More than 100 peaceful protesters were gunned down in the center of Kiev. And then authoritarian regime collapsed and Russia invaded. So what we do in these first years of the war, because as I mentioned, we wasn't prepared and we wasn't equipped with the knowledge of international humanitarian law in this first months of the war. So we focus on the field which is more understandable for us, where international humanitarian law cross with the international law of human rights. And that's why for several years, our main focus was illegal practice of detention, sexual violence, torture, and killing civilians in the occupied territories, as well as political motivated persecutions. And I personally interviewed hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity. They told me horrible stories. They told me how they were beaten, raped, smashed into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, their nails were drilled, they were tortured with electricity through their genitalia, they were compelled to write with their own blood. So horrible, horrible stories. And we sent numerous reports to UN, to Council of Europe, to OSCE, even to European Union, but nothing changed. And this horrible practice was continuing on the occupied territories. And frankly speaking, I started to lose a sense of my work, because I know that in the same time which we document these crimes, the same practice, the same horror is going on in more 143 illegal places of detention, which we identified in 2014 to 2015. And then I told to my team that we have to change our approach. And we understood that this international system of peace and security is not working. So probably we can use energy of people to push this system and to force them to work. And we started to organize the international campaigns. And the most brightful and visible, it was Save Oleksandra Global Action. We started this campaign in 2017. This campaign was devoted to the release of Ukrainian film producer Oleksandra, who started a hunger strike after when he was jailed on false ground. He lived in Crimea, and Russians arrested him because he has pro-Ukrainian sympathy as a citizen of Ukraine, which is normal. And they put him in colony in far north of Russian Federation. So he started this hunger strike with demand to release all political prisoners in Russia. And we, in order to make his voice stronger, organized this Save Oleksandra Global Action. And we managed to unite people, initiatives, and organizations in more than 35 countries in the world. We started with simultaneous demonstrations in the capitals of 35 countries in the world. And people who came to these demonstrations, they have demand not just to abstract Putin, who for sure don't care, but to their own national governments, what their own national governments have to do in order to push Russia to release Ukrainian political prisoners. And to make long story short, in those facts that Oleksandra and dozens Ukrainian political prisoners were released in 2019, it was a huge impact of this thousands and thousands of ordinary people throughout the globe who all this time joined to collective actions which we organized in the frame of the campaign. And this once again showed me that ordinary people have a much great impact that they can even imagine, that ordinary people can change the history quicker than the UN intervention.
Go ahead, Gina.
Oleksandra, I want to ask a drill down question here. When you talk about the new architecture for a peaceful and secure world order, in reading the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we've got beautiful language out there. Is it that we as people, as citizens, have not held our leaders accountable to that language, or do we need entirely new language to describe and hold persecutors accountable for these atrocities?
We have to change the global approach to war crime justice. Let me tell several examples. First, we have to change the understanding what the genocide is. Because when we speak about term of genocide, which was invented by Raphael Lemkin, he mentioned this aspect when the national group can disappear because of forcible change of their identity. And this is some gap in UN Convention of Genocide, which not include this dimension. What do I mean with this? Probably you know that in his last interviews, Putin told to Tucker Carlson once again that Ukraine does not exist, that there is no Ukrainian language, there is no Ukrainian nation, There is no Ukrainian culture. That we are the same people with Russians. And for 10 years, we document how these words transfer to the horrible practice when Russian troops deliberately exterminate active local people on the ground, pastors, journalists, people who fight in for environment, children writers, musicians, any active people of community, how they deliberately destroyed Ukrainian cultural heritage, how they taken Ukrainian children to Russia in order to bring them up as Russians. So altogether, this is just components of genocidal policy which Russian state imposed against Ukrainians. And you don't need to be a lawyer to understand a very common sense. If you want partially or completely destroy some national group, you have two variants. You either have to kill all the representatives of this national group, or you can forcibly change their identity and the entire national group will disappear. And this is something which Russia as empire is doing for centuries, not just with Ukrainians. And second, what I want to emphasize when I speak about the change the global approach to war crime justice, let me remind you that all this horror which we are documenting, it's result of the leadership decision of Putin and top political leadership and high military command of the Russian state to start this war. This means that they have to be punished for their leadership decision, for the crime of aggression, as it's called in international humanitarian law. And this is also common sense, because if we want to prevent wars in the future, we have to punish states and their leaders who start such wars in present. But in the whole history of humankind, we have only one such a precedent. It was Nuremberg trial. All other tribunals, which you probably heard about Rwanda or Yugoslavia or special court in Sierra Leone, it was tribunals which judged people because they killed each other unproportionally, or they killed each other with not in line of international humanitarian law, or with additional cruelty, but not for the fact that they started the war. And that is why we still look to the world through the lens of the Nuremberg trial, where Nazi war criminals were tried only after Nazi regime had collapsed. And what we have to change in 21st century, we have to make justice independent on the fact when and how the war will end. We have to send a signal to the authoritarian leaders in different parts of the globe that doesn't matter, will you win the war, will you lose the war? If you start the aggressive war, you will be punished.
100%, absolutely. And this hits home to me that genocide might not always be the right word, but genocide is exactly what's happening in Ukraine. And I have been saying, and I have really been pounding it home, especially the last few weeks, that we need to start looking at the fact that in my opinion, genocide began in Ukraine this time in 2014, but it has happened, of course, we know historically with the Holodomor, but people have been focusing so much on what has been happening since 2022, but we need to keep a focus also on the fact that this has been happening since 2014. Thank you so much. Gina, go ahead.
Oleksandra, two questions. One is the distinction between war and genocide, which Christina Hook, whom I interviewed, and she's from New Lines Institute and authored that second joint report with Raoul Wallenberg in July of 2023. And she said to me, we've got to make it clear to people that there's war, but there's genocide. And do people see that there's a genocide taking place in the context of war? And then the second question is looking at genocide as process, as Gregory Stanton points out, that it's a process with stages, because what we're stuck on here in the West, it seems, is a fear to use the word genocide, and also a sense that it doesn't get determined as a genocide until all the blood is shed. And that's too late. We have an obligation to prevent genocide. So if you could talk about those two things, the difference between war and genocide and the problems that confusion sets up, and then genocide as process, and is that a helpful model for the work that you're trying to do?
Thank you for these questions. When we speak about genocide, we speak about international crime. And this crime has a very high standard. It's a crime of crimes and very difficult to prove it in international court. Because you have to prove, first and foremost, this so-called genocidal intent. That all these actions which Russia imposed against Ukraine, they are doing with intent partially or completely destroy Ukrainian nation. And when we put all together all these elements, we see this genocidal policy of the Russian state. Like just recently, the occupied power in Luhansk region in Ukraine told that if parents of newborn babies in Luhansk region have no Russian citizens, it will mean that Russians will take these newborn babies and transfer them to Russia to adoptive Russian family. This push Ukrainians to change their, not just to their citizenship, to change their identity. And this is the way how Russians try not just to colonize the occupied territories, but to erode the identity of people who live on this land for centuries and for centuries. But also, you're totally right that we speak about different stages of the genocide. Let me remind all of us that Rwanda genocide not just started suddenly. There were a lot of alarming signs that something horrible is approaching. I read the very dramatic book. It's called To Shake Hand with Evil, and this is a memories of a UN peacekeeper who was there and who observed the years before the genocide and how he tried to prevent it, and UN kept silence and nobody was interested. And then this horror happened, but it was too late, because it's much more easier to prevent things than to deal with the consequences. And what is my biggest worry, not just as a human rights lawyer, but first and foremost as a human being? While we have this different expert discussion whether or not we have enough evidence to prove in international courts that that Russia commit genocide against Ukrainian people, we lost a very important point, that the war is still going on. And if we will not invent how to stop Russians, we can come to the point when even severe skeptics will have no doubt that this is a genocide, but it will be too late for us.
Exactly. Getting people to understand that a genocide is happening is exactly what we need to do and exactly what we're here to do. Gina, did you have another follow-up?
Well, one thing that occurs to me, and it relates to your early work here, is that the narrative in the West, my question is basically going to be, given what I'm about to tell you, how can we, as journalists, which is what I am, better convey that first phase of this current genocide, the 2014 to 2021 phase? Because in the West, the perception tends to be, well, Ukraine was still trying to figure itself out, and a lot of people in Ukraine still wanted to be part of Russia, and that kind of creates a smokescreen in Western minds as to what was going on, when in fact it was the early stages and actually the full-blown stages in certain areas of an active genocide. How can journalists in the West better present the 2014 to 2021 period? What do we need to know? What are we not communicating to get that point across?
I think that there is one obstacle which make the work of journalists who try very professionally and objectively cover what's going on in Ukraine more difficult. This obstacle is that for decades, the West looked to our part of the world through the Russian prism. They have a very less knowledge about Ukraine, about Belarus, about Kazakhstan, about other countries which were in Soviet Union. They know only about Russia and what Russia want them to know about other countries. And this was deeply ingrained in universities, in museums, in art fields, in other kinds of society. Let me show it with one example. There is a very famous museum in United States Metropolitan, and this museum has a painting of Degas. And one painting has a title, Russian Dancers. But if you are Russian and you look to this painting, you have a clear impression that this is not Russian dancers, because all the women who are on this painting are in Ukrainian traditional clothes. And if you are Russians, you know that this is Ukrainian traditional clothes because this woman wear the flower like a crown on their head. It's traditional Ukrainian thing. And scientists from museum field sent numerous letters to this Metropolitan Museum and asked administration to do something or to make some additional note to this title and explain that this title reflects colonial views of Ukraine, or change the name, but just do something because it's not Russian dancers, it's obvious. But museum ignore all this request for years and years. And only when large-scale war started, the administration of museums decided to change the title of this painting. And they called this painting Dancers in Ukrainian Clothes. Probably they still think it's Russian dancers, but they just wearing Ukrainian clothes. But at least it's something. So I think that the main problem for journalists who try to cover this current events is that you have to make a link with the past, because a lot of problems, a lot of explanations are hiding there. And because West have no knowledge about our past and have to discover it from the scratch.
Go ahead, Gina, with the follow-up.
Sure. Just another follow-up question there. In previous segments, we've looked at the systemic abuses that Russia has perpetrated against its own people for years, because we're countering a narrative in the US of Russia as the bastion of orthodoxy and family values, which of course is anything but the case. It's roundly disproven by the social science statistics. But is it helpful in your work if we also include, for example, Human Rights Watch's Confessions at Any Cost report, if we point to historical, intergenerational, systemic human rights abuses in Russia that are now being perpetrated upon Ukrainians? For example, the practice of the torture, the electrocution by genitalia, the beating positions. Is that helpful if we add that? We don't want to take away the focus from Ukraine, but show precedent.
I think that it will help to understand more about nature of what is Russian state is about, because Russia is empire, and like modern archaic empire, they have Tatarstan, Yakutia, Ichkeria, Chechnya, and Ingushetia, and other lands of indigenous people who were captured by Russian Empire. And now these indigenous people live in poverty. Russia deprived them about rights to study their own language in schools and universities. Russia arose their culture with using Russian literature, Russian language as an instrument of colonization. Russia exploited their natural resources. And now, when Russia started large-scale war, the majority of men who were mobilized and sent to die in Ukraine, it's men from these indigenous people. And I heard their representatives in UN General Assembly. They told that we are now small number of our indigenous people, and when Russia killed our men, it's a path for us to die as indigenous people. So when we speak about 140 million of Russians, we have to understand that they are not all Russians. They are Yakut, Ingush, Tatar, Chechen, and other people. And we deprive them of their identity. We don't hear their voice, and we have provided more focus on their fight for their human rights and freedoms, as well as representatives of the indigenous people. And what is also show that empire have very sensitive nature, which means that empire has a center but has no borders. When empire has energy, empire always try to expand. This is the nature of empire. When empire have no energy, empire will wait for the time to have this energy and to attack again.
Thank you. Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Oleksandra. I know that one of the things that you've brought me back to is that focus on community and understanding how to not see the world around Russia through the Russian lens. And that is difficult to do. I think one of the things that has been the biggest treasure of this community here on Mriya Report is to hear the experiences from people who were growing up during the Soviet era and have experienced both that suppression and their liberty afterward. To hear those stories first person versus through a book is huge. And I think that really ties into the concept you've described of global solidarity and how we build and leverage that global community. What is the most important thing that you think we as citizens of the world can do to help understand each other better and to understand how important our human rights for everybody, how important that concept truly is? What's the one thing we should do today, tomorrow, the next day to make that difference?
People can do a lot to help and to change the situation. And probably I can't name just one thing because each person can decide better for himself or for herself what he or she can do in this regard. But if I can focus on one issue, I will focus on the following, that people sometimes confused peace and occupation. What do I mean? People know that the war is horrible, and that's why they start to think in very naive way that, okay, probably occupation is bad, but it's better than war because it decreases human suffering. But the truth is that occupation is not decrease the human suffering. Occupation is just another form of the war, and that's not peace. Russian occupation means torture, rape, enforced disappearances, denial of your identity, forcible adoption of your own children, filtration camps, and mass graves. It's not just about changing one state flag to another. People in occupation live in gray zone. They have no tools how to defend their rights, their freedom, their property, their lives, and their beloved ones. And I know what I'm saying because I have been documenting war crimes for 10 years already. And that's why when someone proposes, let's speak about peace, which means that let's give up a part of Ukrainian territories, who knows, probably Russia will stop. But first, it's a wrong perception because Russia will not stop. Russia occupied Crimea, Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and use this 8 years just to prepare for the next attack. As I explained previously, this is the nature of empire. But it's also immoral claims, because let's speak honestly that we propose to leave people alone for torture and death under Russian occupation. And you know what? We have no moral right to do this because it's our relatives, it's our friends, it's our neighbors, it's human beings. And Ukraine in this war, we are fighting not just to restore international order and our territorial integrity. We are fighting first and foremost for people, for our people who live there. Let me probably describe this with one concrete story. I just found the words of Protestant pastor Oleksandra Matviichuk, whom I'm interviewed by myself. Russia tried to create image of very religious country, but Russia persecute all churches, confessions, and religious organizations in occupied territories, trying to impose only one Moscow Patriarch Church there. So how this Protestant pastor described his experience? They hung me up for a hook and put a gas mask on me. They clenched a hole at the end of the tube, blocking the airstream so I couldn't breathe. When I was unconscious, they opened the hole and covered it with a cloth soaked in ethanol. I did a deep breath because I was on the brink of loss of conscience and I felt a fire in my chest. I coughed and gasped from a lack of fresh air, and then they began to beat me again and again with batons on my chest and backs, which was repeated over and over again.
We all have a moral obligation to stop this. Gina?
Yes, and Oleksandra, I just did an article on how Russia seized another Ukrainian Greek Catholic church, Saint Archstrategist Michael in occupied Kherson, and then rededicated it to the Russian Orthodox Church, further trying to obliterate, yet another faith in Ukraine. One of the things that the West balks at when naming a genocide is a very real awareness that it's got skeletons in its own closet. In the United States, for example, we have been, involved in the genocide of our indigenous peoples historically as part of our origin narrative. So that's a deep-seated genocide we've not come to terms with the genocide against various people of color, Black communities here and other communities. What can Western nations and other nations, any nation that has a genocide in its past or hasn't fully reckoned with its own atrocities, what can they do to overcome that and say, we still want to be moral, we acknowledge our own sins, and we're going after you for the ones you're committing against Ukrainians and other people now? How do we get past that? How do we reckon with that?
I think that we at least can speak about two dimensions. I will start with this Russian war against Ukraine because I'm Ukrainian and I know what's going on. I'm in Kiev. My native city is constantly being shelled by Russian rockets, and I dedicated my work to help people affected by this war. So I work with human pain on daily basis, and on this dimension, I will ask for your support, because we can't face with this challenge only by ourselves. It's true that Russia is enormous opposing power, and the success of Ukrainians who broke this Russian strategy to occupy Ukraine in 3-4 days have two components. The first component is bravery of Ukrainian people who decided to fight for our freedom, for our country, for our people, and for our human dignity, even with such enormous power as Russia is. But second component is your support, because when people in different countries saw these pictures and photos from Bucha, where the civilians' bodies were lay scattered around the streets until liberation, they start to make pressure to their own governments and demand them to stop this horror. And then we started to receive first weapons to be able to defend ourselves, and first real sanctions against Russia were introduced into force. But also I will speak about more broader dimension, not just as Ukrainians, but as a human being, because I know that not just in Ukraine, but in other countries, in different parts of the globe, now in the same second, people are fighting for their freedom, for their human dignity, and very often they fighting in the circumstances when the law doesn't work, and when all this their efforts may seem have no senses. And I have two messages. First, to these people, I want to say that their efforts matter, that even when they face with enormous power, we have to continue our fight, and result, even unexpectedly, will be achieved. And second message, more broadly, that people who live in more peaceful countries and more stable environments, we have to unite our efforts and start jointly to push politicians to change the international system of peace and security, because it's not working. It can't protect people against authoritarianism and the wars. Before, it was obvious for people in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iran, in Sudan, in Nicaragua, but now it's obvious for people even in well-developed Western communities that the whole world order is collapsing before our eyes. And if we will not join our efforts and do something, it means that in nearest future, such fires will emerge more and more often in different parts of the globe, because the whole international wiring is faulty and sparks are everywhere.
Alexandra, thank you so much. Now, we had 45 minutes with you, and we're at 47 minutes with you. So I need to say thank you very much. If you have a little bit more time to spend with us, we will definitely keep talking. But if you need to go, we totally understand, and I really so appreciate you joining us today.
Probably we will use 10 minutes, which we have till the hour will pass, to get questions from the audience. If someone wants to ask me something or just to tell me something, I will be very grateful.
Thank you so much. We've tried to. We knew this would be be an intense time, so I appreciate it. TK Bach, go ahead.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this again because you're such a clear communicator. I'd like to go back to what you said about the genocide and the evidence that you uncovered of the genocide beginning in 2014, right? And we're thinking Euromaidan with the snipers opening fire on the people in the streets, right? Followed by the little green men coming into Luhansk and and Donetsk. In your investigations of those genocidal acts and crimes against humanity early on in 2014, did you uncover any evidence or information about what Russia was doing prior to that flashpoint that drew our attention to it? And if so, what do we need to know about what Russia was doing and how they were covertly engaging in acts to undermine Ukrainian identity prior to the Euromaidan revolution and the Little Green Men invasion? Thank you.
Thank you for this important question. Probably I will allow myself to answer on this way. I will focus your attention to the brilliant report which was made by Russian Human Rights Center Memorial. This organization was co-recipient with us of Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. And unfortunately, months ago, the head of Human Rights Center Memorial, Oleg Orlov, was jailed in Russia. And I'm now the only one head of human rights organizations who received Nobel Peace Prize in 2022, who are free, not in jail. And in this report, they analyze Russian tactics fighting in Chechnya, in Syria, and in Ukraine. And they made the very concrete conclusions that this is the same war crime playbook, that Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. It's a conscious policy of Russian state. They deliberately inflicting the immense pain on civilians in order to break their resistance and occupy the country. When I try to explain this cruelty, I always try to explain that this cruelty is for very pragmatic and cynical purpose. It's better to explain with one example of scientific experiment which was done in past century, rather cruel scientific experiment, I must admit. The scientists beat dogs with electricity when this dog tried to eat. And every time when the dog provide attempt to eat, this dog receives this electrical shock beating. And this resulted in situation when this poor animal decided to die in hunger pain, but didn't provide any attempt to eat, which means to survive. And this phenomena scientists called learned helplessness. And I have the impressions that Russians use these tactics in a frame of the whole country. They try to provide so enormous pain for us to ingrain this learned helplessness feeling that we'll have no energy to resist. They did it in Chechnya, in Syria, in Myanmar, in Mali, in Libya, in other countries of the world, and they have never been punished. And this is a problem, that all this horror which we now face in Ukraine is a result of this long-lasting tradition of impunity. And now it leads to a situation that Russians really think that they can do whatever they want.
Thank you so much. Martin, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Prince, and Nancy, and Oleksandra. Slava Ukraini from Martin Zelig in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And thank you, Oleksandra, for your powerful presentation. And I'm glad that you mentioned that you had read the book Shake Hands with the Devil, The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda. That was by retired Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, Canadian, who was head of the UN Force Commander peacekeeping mission in Rwanda at the time of the genocide there. And I think the lessons that he writes about in his magnificent and very moving book um, are ones that we still, as you have pointed out, Oleksandra, are ones that we still have to learn. And I use the royal we because I don't only mean the leaders of the free world, and I emphasize that the free world, the Western world, the liberal democracies, perhaps more precisely, but many of our fellow citizens as well. And that is, as someone said, that the moral outrage that um, we have that we can't lose at what genocidal Muscovy is doing to our ally, democratic Ukraine. And I think we have to. Sorry for my rambling. We have to keep that outrage foremost in when we speak to people about what is happening. Those who may be blasé or skeptical or cynical about it. I think we have to point this out. And your very powerful, very moving presentation is. Um, Evidence that we can use to show what is happening in Ukraine. And let me just, apart from that little speech, and thank you for allowing me to speak, just to ask you, when do you think more um, war crime charges will be brought against the terrorist leadership in the Kremlin, in particular the head gangster Putler. We have one already, of course, for the abduction of the Ukrainian children. But when do you think, if that's a fair question, more such charges will be brought against this international war criminal? And I'll just end off by saying Slava Ukraini, and thank you for listening to me, and thank you for your presentation.
Heroyam Slava. Thank you for this question. I think that one of the main lessons learned which we have to make from the whole history of humankind is that unpunished evil grow. And that means that this problem has no border. Like when we speak about Russian war against Ukraine, this is not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. Once again, Putin started this war when Ukraine got a chance for democratic transition. And if we will not be able to stop Putin in Ukraine, he will go further. On Russian TV, Russians publicly discussed what the next country they will attack, Estonia or Poland. It means that if war scenario happen, not just European countries, but their alliance, like people, for example, from the United States, will have to come and to pay the highest price which we as a human being have, the love of our beloved ones. So I think that we can stop this scenario also with justice attempt, because when now Ukrainian promoting the idea of creation of special tribunal to hold Putin and his surrounding accountable for their leadership decision to start this war, it's also an ambitious to stop wars as such, to put the wars beyond the legal frame, to make very clear that if you start the aggressive war, you will be punished. And I know that politicians sometimes don't understand the power of justice. They think that justice probably have some impact on past because people were judged for something bad with a committed in already. And probably justice, they think that justice can have some impact to the future because you send a signal to authoritarian leaders that if you start to do the same, you will be punished. But what they don't understand, that justice has impact to present. What do I mean? When we speak about the circle of impunity, which Russia enjoyed for decades, committing horrible war crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria, if we start decisive legal action and even only part of Russians will be in doubt that probably this time they will not avoid responsibility, that probably this time they will be responsible for actions which they commit by their own hands or for their own decisions. Even if part of Russians start to be doubt, it will have a frozen effect to brutality of human rights violations. And because we are in a large-scale war, it means that we can save thousands, thousands, and thousands of lives.
Thank you. Now we are at the top of the hour. We do have 2 more questions. Can you squeeze that, or do you need to go?
Let's hear these 2 questions, and then I will answer to both these questions, and we sum up.
All right. We will do the last 2 questions, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Ben, go ahead.
Thank you, Prince. Thanks, Nancy. And thank you, Oleksandra, for coming on today. I'll try to be real quick. When the full-scale invasion happened, I'm an American citizen, but I knew the danger, and everything you say, I believe is true. And in part from my family history, because my father is from the area near Chernivtsi. And when the Soviets came in World War II, they did exactly what they're doing now. And my grandfather was deported to Russia, and his mother died in Kazakhstan. And so we experienced the Russian experience firsthand. And so that's why I know right now what and could respond. My question to you is, because you go around now and you talk to a lot of people, I understand who we want to respond, but who do you find responds now? Who as a group of people or individuals? I mean, obviously we care about Ukraine and Mriya report and so we all respond, we all understand. But what, in your experience, and it's very vast, who is responding to your message? And what do they say? And what do they say in a positive way? I'm interested in finding more people like that. Thank you.
Thank you. And probably a second question, and I will answer after this to both of them.
Do you think that that a military complete defeat and withdrawal of Russian troops in Ukraine will cause a change in Russia, or do you think that, much like the dog, they are incapable of change now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will start with the second question, and I will allow myself to quote my Russian human rights colleagues, because when I ask them how to help, because they found themselves in very vulnerable situations, human rights organizations in Russia are closed. My colleagues are labeled as foreign agents. Some of them have to leave the country. Some of them were jailed. Some of them continue their work being in constant danger to be killed or jailed. And it's very vulnerable situation because they face not just against Putin's regime, but with a majority of Russian people opinion. They're a real tiny minority now in Russian society. And when I ask them how we can help, they always respond, if you want to help us, please be successful. Because only success of Ukraine and military defeat of Russia will provide a chance for democratic future of Russia itself. For sure, there is no guarantee. There is no guarantee at all in our life, but at least they will get this chance. And this is a luxury to have it. And I know that Russians will tolerate war criminal as a head of the state, but they will never tolerate loser war criminal. And first question, let me answer like this. We people who live in different countries, we have different political views, different religions, different gender, different ideologies, different professions, different behaviors, but there is something which unites all of us. This is that we are all human beings, and this helps us to find a universal language. And when I or my other colleagues speak about Ukrainian struggle for freedom, this narrative story is very understandable for all people, regardless who they are. When I describe the pain of mother whose newborn child was killed after Russian rocket hit maternity hospital in Zaporizhia, the pain of this mother also is very understandable to all people, regardless of their citizenship, their religion, political views, ideology, etc., etc., because we're all human. And this means that there are a lot of things which have no limitation in national borders. And not just human pain is such a thing. It's human solidarity also. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to be a little sneaky here and just try really quick. Princess, go ahead. Because you are Ukrainian, I will slip you in.
Okay, and I'm going to start by thanking Oleksandra in Ukrainian. Oleksandra, моє ім'я є Ксенія, я є американка з українським корінням і хочу тобі дуже щиро подякувати, що ви до нас тут прилучилися і нас всіх вчиш про що діється в Україні, в світі. Знов дуже дякую тобі.
Дуже дякую.
And I'm going to switch to English. Прошу дуже. I'm going to switch. I just thanked Oleksandra for being here, and for taking time out of her very busy day, and for teaching us all what we all need to learn about what's going on in Ukraine and the world at the hands of Russia. So my question to you, Oleksandra, is this: what will it take, in your opinion, for the Western world and Western leadership to actually hold Russia accountable for its empirical reach around the globe, not just in Ukraine, but everywhere else where they have a stranglehold? And what will it take for us to beat back that death grip on various points globally, including Ukraine? And how do we get to that point? How can we, as a global community of citizens, assist in this? I know it's a long question, but in whatever way you can answer that, please do.
Thank you very much. I think that it's a reachable goal, but first we have to set the goal. What do I mean? When large-scale war started, the civilized world told, let's help Ukraine not to fail. And Ukraine started to obtain the first weapons to be able to defend ourselves. First sanctions against Russia were introduced into force, and we are extremely grateful because it's helped us to survive. But this is also an explanation why Ukraine was waiting for a first modern tank for more than a year, why we still have a zero modern plane. And we had to start our counteroffensive last year without any possibility to secure Ukrainian sky against bombs, planes, and rockets. Because there is a huge differences between two goals. Let's help Ukraine not to fail, and let's help Ukraine to win. And we can practically measure these differences in types of weapons, in speed of decisions, and gravity of sanctions. And we have to convince our political leaders to set this goal, let's help Ukraine to win, because we are fighting not just for ourselves, we are fighting for the whole international order, which was established after the Second World War, which means that we, with all our efforts, are trying to prevent the third one, which means that people in well-developed democracies are safe only because we are fighting. And the truth is that we have no time. The time for Ukrainians converted in numerous deaths in battlefield, in numerous deaths in occupied territories, in numerous deaths in deep prayer. Democracy must win wars. And this is something which we can demonstrate with our joint efforts.
Thank you. That is perfect. And as you were answering another question, it just brought to my mind your words again. It is enough to be just a human. Oleksandra, I cannot thank you enough for joining us today. You have given us extra time, which I appreciate so much. And you are welcome to join us again anytime. But I feel like we should let you go. And again, I just want to thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation with you, such an important conversation. And thank you so, so much for being with us today.
Thank you for this unique opportunity.
Very good. Very good. Thank you again. And if you would like, I can drop you down to listener and we can go on here. But thank you again so, so much. It is so, so appreciated. And you have yourself a great day. And Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Slava Nazi.
Smert Ворогам.
Thank you guys so much. Oh, boy. That was wonderful and intense and fabulous. Gina, do you have any thoughts?
I have plenty of thoughts. No, I think it was just incredible, a great honor to speak with Oleksandra, and I encourage people to listen, to reread, to visit her website, to read her Nobel Prize acceptance speech, and follow the website closely. Everything that she has said is just so prescient, so timely, and she speaks from deep experience and combines so beautifully what Nancy so often referred to as, the kind of the head and the heart approach here, to be able to feel deeply and empathically with those who suffer, and also to bring to bear the best of logic, of ethics, of morals, everything that we need, every arrow in our quiver to fight this horrific genocide for both Ukrainians, but also for humanity itself. And centering it there is so key. It reminds me of what we discussed last night with Elie Wiesel's quote, which I'll read again for those who weren't here, but Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, a fellow Nobel Peace Prize recipient who received his own award in 1986. And during his acceptance speech, he said, "Sometimes we must interfere when human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy. National borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, That place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. And I think that so underscores what Oleksandra was saying, that this is not just, and those who would say that this is just about Ukraine could not be more mistaken. This is about humanity itself. And as she said in her Nobel acceptance speech, this is about authoritarianism versus democracy. And all of the studies show that though it is far from perfect, democracy is the best system we have at present for preserving human freedoms to the greatest extent and for ensuring human flourishing. Again, it's not perfect, but it gets us much further along the path than any system that Vladimir Putin is proposing and those who are of his like mind and intent. They do not have any answers to this. And I once again reiterate, especially to my co-religionists in the United States and in the West, those who think that Russia is somehow this bastion of traditional values, of saving civilization, the new Rome, who bought into any of that, please hear the voice of Oleksandra, hear the voices of other Ukrainians who know all too well that that Russian prism of which Oleksandra spoke is badly clouded. And actually, I would go so far as to say, and I hope this is not an indelicate analogy, but that prism is very much stained with Ukrainian blood and the blood of other nations. And we actually need to see that blood to see the reality.